On the 22nd of August 1910, the Korean peninsula was officially annexed and incorporated into the Japanese Empire, casting the largely semi-feudal agricultural-based Korean population under the centralized control of a modern industrialized emerging imperial power, and marking the beginnings of a cruel colonial regime which enacted countless atrocities upon its colonized subjects. In response to Japanese imperial claims, the New People's Association, led by prominent, professionally educated Korean independence activists such as An Chang-ho and the anarchist Shin Chae-ho, sought to adapt and refine Western Enlightenment principles in service of their vision for an independent Korean nation-state. Central to this vision was the Enlightenment ideal of progress, which was harnessed as a means to cultivate a modern, self-determined society capable of resisting colonial domination and asserting Korean sovereignty on the global stage. An Chang-ho was a Korean freedom fighter who, during his lifetime, had been involved in the movements of various independence organizations. In his struggle, An Chang-ho can be categorized as an agent of change that brought the spirit of progress to Korea. This enthusiasm was inseparable from the background of his youth, in which he studied the West and embraced Christianity. An Chang-ho was aware that old Korean values such as Confucianism, feudalism, and the form of monarchy government were no longer suitable for Korea. Such efforts introduced the idea of progress, built schools, and introduced the modern Korean identity that has shaped Korean society today. The introduction of Enlightenment notions of progress into the lived realities of the colonized Korean populace now offered more holistic concepts of linear time, in which progress became associated with the transformative movement from the remnants of feudalism toward a modern, rational, agential, and liberated form of sovereignty that would overcome the humiliation and suffering associated with Japanese colonialism. At the same time, however, Japan's colonial administration in Korea was laying the foundations for Western-influenced biopolitical institutions designed to train colonial administrators in the advanced bureaucratic and technical skills needed to efficiently manage Korea's resources and population. These institutions also served to sustain colonial knowledge acquisition and production, thereby advancing Japan's own vision of biopolitical colonial progress. In this context, the Korean independence movement emerged as both a struggle against the imposition of one form of colonial modernity and for the assertion of its own sovereign vision of modernity. Additionally, the Korean independence movement's vision of progress gave rise to diverging ideological currents. An Chang-ho's Christian-influenced interpretation of Western progress fostered a form of social liberal nationalism, whilst Shin Chae-ho's advocacy for a more indigenous and Confucian-inflected adaptation of Western progress inspired strains of anarchism and communism, laying the ideological groundwork for the later development of North Korea's Juche doctrine. In spite of such divergences, the linear vision of progress towards independence remained consistent and would find full expression in the defeat of the Japanese Empire and the end of its colonial rule in Korea in 1945. Yet, the subsequent division of the Korean peninsula after the Second World War once again split these visions of progress and modernity, as the South came to embody an American-backed, Christian-aligned nationalism rooted in domestic capitalism, whilst the North pursued a Soviet-backed communism grounded in revolutionary class struggle. For the South Korean sociologist Chang Kyung-Sup, the years prior to the outbreak of the Korean War saw the American-aligned capitalist model of progress and modernity in the minority, as the call for class struggle and revolution resonated strongly with the South's largely rural, semi-peasant-based population, which still perceived itself as bound to colonial Japanese administration and colonial class structures which remained intact upon American military occupation. South Korea and other societies under American politico-military influence were induced or forced to transform into the modern political, economic, and social systems by which they would ultimately be incorporated into the new global political economy under American leadership and interest. Such neo-coloniality was not evenly welcomed or tolerated among different sections of South Korean polity and society, but the Korean War came to effectively help disempower critical positions and voices within civil society. The disempowerment and eventual mass violence against communists in the South, carried out in alliance with former Japanese collaborators, dispossessed North Koreans, and the United States military, found brutal expression in the 1948 Jeju Massacre and the 1950 Bodo League Massacre. In these events, tens of thousands of largely rural communists and suspected sympathizers were executed for their ideological and national commitments, effectively annihilating the communist movement and revolutionary vision of modern progress as grounded in class struggle, and cementing the hegemony of an American-backed capitalist and ethno-nationalist conception of modern progress across southern Korea. The failures of the First Republic of Korea to sustain the material conditions of its populace and uphold democratic governance culminated in the April Revolution of 1960, which brought an end to the Syngman Rhee regime and briefly rekindled hopes for democratic progress. However, this moment of promise was short-lived. In 1961, the military coup led by former Japanese collaborator Park Chung-hee dismantled the fragile democratic order as motivated by fears that continued political paralysis and economic stagnation would enable the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to absorb the South and reunify the peninsula under Juche communism. Under Park's military dictatorship, the vision of progress and modernity were revitalized and pursued outside the frameworks of democracy or socialism, and initiated through an aggressive Promethean campaign of state-led industrialization and state capitalist modernization throughout the 1960s and 70s. This relentless campaign, however, came at a steep human cost, as the South Korean working class endured exploitative labor conditions, deepening alienation, and the imposition of authoritarian social control. Whilst Park's state capitalist modernization efforts claimed to realize the vision of progress and modernization for South Korean society, the simultaneous currents of authoritarian repression, military dictatorship, and American imperialism reignited among the South Korean masses a vision of progress and modernity rooted in democracy, labor rights, civil liberties, and popular mobilization. Both the Yushin regime under Park Chung-hee and the subsequent military dictatorship of Chon Do-hwan sparked protest movements that drew ideological continuity from the Korean independence struggle, emphasizing the values of popular sovereignty, social justice, anti-imperialism, and the empowerment of workers and citizens against authoritarian control. Ever since Korea's colonial modernity in terms of grassroots socialist sentiment and nationalist social liberalism was violently frustrated under the American military occupation and during the Korean War, progressive nationalist intellectuals and activists have pursued national liberation through high-profile cultural movements, social protests, and political struggles that have constituted the main ideological force in civil society. The victory of the democracy movement, following years of ruthless repression exemplified by the brutal Gwangju massacre, reached a decisive turning point during the June democratic struggle of 1987. Students, workers, opposition politicians, and the broader masses whose numbers and influence had grown alongside South Korea's rapid economic development and rising social mobility, mobilized en masse to demand an end to authoritarian rule. Confronted with widespread protests, international scrutiny, and economic pressure, the government conceded to constitutional reforms, enabling democratic elections and the peaceful transfer of power, in addition to greater political freedoms and civil liberties ensured for the South Korean populace. The popular vision of progress and modernity was further reinforced by the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics, which symbolically announced South Korea's emergence onto the global stage as an open and culturally influential society in democratic transition. Notably, the turn of the century, in line with this popular vision of progressive South Korean modernity, was believed to usher in a new era of political stability, socio-economic prosperity, and individual agency, where democratic governance, technological advancement, and global engagement would reinforce the nation's identity as a modern, prosperous, forward-looking liberal society. In the 21st century, however, this Enlightenment-based vision of progress and modernity, born of Korean resistance to imperialism, has fragmented and corroded into an acceleration of biopolitical, techno-scientific capacities and excessive neoliberalized social relations, where market optimization and individualized competition for wealth are the defining features of one's social life. The very rights, liberties, freedoms, and opportunities for agency that such a vision of progress was meant to secure have now been forgotten and overshadowed by hyper-individualized pursuits of success, fame, status, and personal health, in a society now propelled by an unrelenting intensification of 21st century progress. Additionally, the once progressive vision of democratic political stability has eroded into cycles of political scandal, corruption, and oligarchic control. Socio-economic prosperity has splintered into widening inequality, social fragmentation, and corporate monopolization, and the promise of individual agency has been subsumed into relentless mass consumerism, capital accumulation, and technologically curated, hyper-simulated realities. What was once hailed as the miracle on the Han River for Korea's state-led rapid economic development in the mid to late 20th century has become the mirage on the Han River, as South Korean society, under the edifice of neoliberal modernity, confronts new societal pressures and structural crises that threaten to undermine the long-revered legacy of progress and modernization. Beginning with Japan, and then followed by the so-called four Asian tigers, the capitalist economies of East Asia achieved a remarkable performance, leading some to refer to this meteoric rise as the East Asian miracle. This miraculous performance has often been associated with the role of developmental states. Although South Korea, as one of the Asian tigers, was once considered an exemplary country of the East Asian miracle, it now suffers from slow growth and rising inequality. In fact, Korea has exemplified a tumultuous journey, including the economic miracle that began in the 1960s under the authoritarian developmental states, democratization from 1987, the financial crisis of 1997, and subsequent reform and opening up. However, gone are the days when Korea could boast of its fast growth rates. Rather, the country is now facing slowing growth and rising inequality. In fact, Korea has dramatically transformed from a society known for high fertility, a high marriage rate, and a low divorce rate into one with the world's lowest fertility rate, widespread singlehood, and a rising divorce rate, all trends that resemble other typical high-income societies. On a more tragic level, South Korean society grapples with high levels of debt, alienation, exploitation, and suicide, ranking among the highest in global suicide rates, and even coining the term kwarosa to describe deaths caused by extreme overwork, whether through physical collapse or work-induced suicide. The country's position at the lowest end of global fertility rankings further reflects an accelerating atomization of life, where overwork, precarious living, and technological convenience have reframed family formations as either an unbearable burden or an irrelevant pursuit. Likewise, the overwhelming dominance of corporate conglomerates, epitomized by Samsung, whose technological and infrastructural reach permeates nearly every aspect of South Korean society, and whose operations account for roughly 20% of the national GDP, illustrates a deepening subservience to market forces on a national scale. Together, these conditions point toward a broader crisis of meaning, in which economic growth and technological progress have failed to deliver collective purpose, replacing it instead with hyper-competitive survivalism, biopolitical health regimes, simulated realities, and the slow erosion of social bonds. For the Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, South Korea epitomizes one of the most advanced forms of what he terms the burnout society. Societies defined by neoliberal self-exploitation, chronic exhaustion, and the internalization of restless productivity, where overwork, anxiety, and perpetual self-surveillance become the default conditions of existence. Crucially for Han, freedom in the burnout society becomes inverted, transforming into a form of self-imposed coercion, in which individuals voluntarily overextend themselves under the illusion of agency and autonomy. This inversion turns the promise of self-determination into a trap of self-exploitation, where the drive to achieve, optimize, and compete is internalized so deeply that exhaustion, anxiety, and eventual collapse are mistaken for the natural costs of a successful life. As Han reaffirms of the neoliberal achievement subject, that the late modern achievement subject does not pursue works of duty. Its maxims are not obedience, law, and the fulfillment of obligation, but rather freedom, pleasure, and inclination. Above all, it expects the profits of enjoyment from work. It works for pleasure and does not act at the behest of the other. Instead, it hearkens mainly to itself. After all, it must be a self-starting entrepreneur. The achievement subject gives itself over to freestanding compulsion in order to maximize performance. In this way, it exploits itself. Auto-exploitation is more efficient than allo-exploitation because a deceptive feeling of freedom accompanies it. The exploiter is simultaneously the exploited. Exploitation now occurs without domination. That is what makes self-exploitation so efficient. The capitalist system is switching from allo-exploitation to auto-exploitation in order to accelerate. On the basis of the paradoxical freedom it holds, the achievement subject is simultaneously perpetrator and victim, master and slave. Freedom and violence now coincide. In this context, the vision of progress first set out by members of the Korean independence movement in opposition to Japanese imperialism has since been inverted to legitimize the progress inherent to the logic of neoliberal capitalism. Progress which no longer accounts for the dignity of individuals in terms of their participation in a shared political destiny, their social belonging, or their capacity to shape the future, but has instead individualized the Korean populace to the scale of biopolitical governance, reducing them to mere instruments of market growth and capital accumulation. No longer tethered to the progressive movement toward collective liberation, this trajectory advances only the liberation of ever-expanding market frontiers and techno-scientific ventures, draining the capacity for long-term meaning-making into oblivion. Caught between the disembodied illusions of techno-scientific hyperreal simulations and the hollow forward march of progress toward nothingness, South Korean society emerges as a crucible in which two forces converge: an endless proliferation of images, data, and virtual desires detached from lived reality, and an economic political order that measures all value by market expansion alone. Their collision erodes any stable ground for meaning, leaving individuals suspended in a state where reality feels both overstimulated and empty, an environment ripe for pathological phantasms and ultimately the abyss of nihilism at the heart of 21st century neoliberal Asian modernity. For Kyung-Sup, the trajectory of South Korea's development over the course of the mid to late 20th and early 21st century comprises a form of what he considers compressed modernity, in which multiple stages of societal modernization, such as economic growth, industrialization, democratization, globalization, and techno-cultural transformation, are condensed into a much shorter time period than what earlier modern industrial societies experienced. Whereas Britain's industrialization and modernization unfolded gradually over the course of 3 centuries, South Korea's was rapidly condensed into just 3 to 4 decades, transforming a war-ridden agrarian society into a beacon of techno-scientific advancement. Unlike Britain, where industrialization sequentially paved way for democratization, which in turn gave rise to post-industrialization and eventual global technologization over an extended period of history. South Korea's compressed modernization witnessed all such stages of development occur and collide simultaneously, producing a dense, hybrid, and unstable social reality. As Kyung-Sup reaffirms on the conditions of compressed modernity, that compressed modernity is a civilizational condition in which economic, political, social, and/or cultural changes occur in an extremely condensed manner with regard to both time and space, and in which the dynamic coexistence of mutually disparate historical and social elements leads to the construction and reconstruction of a highly complex and fluid social system. Compressed modernity can be manifested at various levels of human existence and experience, that is, personhood, family, secondary organizations, urban-rural localities, societal units, and, not least importantly, the global society. At each of these levels, people's lives need to be managed intensely, intricately, and flexibly in order to remain normally integrated with the rest of society. Under such conditions of compressed modernization, the conflicting temporalities and social logics of the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern are forged into a single historical moment of transformation, producing a hybrid social reality in which past, present, and future do not succeed one another in a seemingly stable unfolding of historical time, but instead manifest and coexist simultaneously. Additionally, Kyung-Sup's notion of compressed modernity is further aligned with the notion of hypermodernity, which the Canadian sociologist Jacques Réaume describes as modernity in excess, from which technological progress accelerates dramatically with new sources of energy for the accumulation and production of knowledge, whilst time itself is reduced to a resource for further acceleration. The past, present, and future in this sense are no longer experienced as distinct horizons, but are collapsed into a single, fleeting, mass-producible moment for the ascension of biopolitical hegemony and capital accumulation. In the case of South Korea, traditional collectivist Confucian hierarchies and values are interwoven with market hierarchies, capitalist logic, and individualism, whilst pre-modern family obligations are aligned with modern work discipline and consumer lifestyles. Likewise, remnants of agrarian existence persist alongside techno-scientific capitalist globalization, and democracy coexists uneasily with authoritarian residues, which still often reinforce rather than negate one another. In this context, notions of space and time become fluid and malleable, with space increasingly serving as a site of techno-cultural transformation, whilst time collapses into an ever-accelerating present. In service to neoliberal capitalism, the compressed South Korean subject is therefore compelled to inhabit contradictory temporalities and social logics, living as both the agent and the instrument of an unstable, hybrid, and liquid modernity. As South Korea has been aggressively and precipitously engaged in institutional and techno-scientific modernization, economic development, political democratization, economic and socio-cultural globalization, and, most recently, ethno-national reformation, its citizens have been exhorted or have exhorted themselves to engage intensely in each of these transformations, and their citizenship, constituted by identities, duties, and rights, have been very much framed and substantiated by the conditions, processes, and outcomes of such transformative engagements. Whilst the condition of compressed modernity is not unique to South Korea, with other East Asian societies, such as Japan, Taiwan, China, Singapore, and Vietnam, also undergoing rapid condensed transformations, Kyung-Sup nevertheless argues that South Korea's trajectory was distinct, as its process of modern transformation was shaped by the enduring biopolitical legacies of Japanese imperial institutions and by the capitalist market logic imported from the United States. Crucially, such external models of progress and modernization did not entirely contradict, but rather intersected with the visions of progress espoused by the Korean independence movement and later democracy movements. As a result, competing and overlapping visions of modernity, including those external to Korean visions of progress, became entangled in the very foundations of modern South Korean society. As Kyung-Sup declares, upon its colonization of Korea, Japan tried to symbolically justify its imperial rule by building, mostly in Seoul, grandiose public buildings in classic Western style. Seoul's Japan-built Western architectural masterpieces included the now demolished Cheongdokbu Colonial Government Complex, the Bank of Chosun, now the Bank of Korea, Seoul Station, Gyeongsang Imperial University, etc. After liberation from war-defeated Japan, South Koreans had to confront another phase of colonial rule, this time by the directly Western power of the American Military Occupation Authority. However, the above Japan-built Western buildings remained intact, both physically and functionally. South Korea's indignation about Japanese colonialism was translated into a nationalistic aspiration for outdoing Japan in West-set modernization, and the American engagement and influence only helped to reinforce this collective historical desire. South Koreans were thereby reborn into a zealous student nation of Western modernity and have remained so to date. Following Korea's liberation in 1945 and the subsequent development of South Korea in the mid to late 20th century, much of the competitive, hierarchical, and bureaucratic structures established under Japanese imperial rule remained intact, directly shaping South Korea's authoritarian, developmental state. South Korea itself harbored many former Japanese collaborators, most notably Park Chung-hee, who drew explicitly on Japan's late 19th century modernization as a blueprint for South Korea's own industrialization efforts. Additionally, Japan's colonial administration had sought to regulate nearly every dimension of Korean life, from education to family structures, health, and productivity, in service to colonial discipline and modernization. Post-colonial South Korea inherited this apparatus of biopolitical population control and repurposed it towards modern nation building and state-led capitalist development. Simultaneously, American influence upon South Korea reframed progress and modernization in Cold War terms, as American aid was cast as progress against communism, and American economic advisors who assisted South Korea towards an export-driven economy deemed global market integration as the very measure of progress and modernity. Alongside this, the importation and emulation of American cultural, social, and later political models were heralded as the inception of Western modernity on the Korean peninsula. In this context, even as many South Koreans institutionally sought to pursue the visions of progress and modernization articulated by the Korean independence movement and later democracy movements, they simultaneously inherited pre-established notions of progress and modernity, which subtly orientated societal development towards hierarchical control, restless economic productivity, and global competitiveness. Most notably, South Korea's renowned hyper-competitive education model, which heavily determines one's symbolic status in society, stems not only from the legacy of the Confucian emphasis on scholarly achievement and merit, but also from Japan's colonial bureaucracy in Korea, which competitively trained administrators in technical skills, administrative efficiency, and disciplined governance, partially laying the groundwork for an education system that prioritizes performance, conformity, social stratification, and forms of empirical knowledge production central to a modern societal order. The organizational logic of Japan's large family-owned conglomerates, known as zaibatsu, which were central to Japan's empire-building efforts, also profoundly influenced South Korea's later domestic conglomerates, or chaebols, including Samsung, LG, and Hyundai, that emerged and consolidated power under Park Chung-hee's regime. In this sense, notions of progress and modernity in Korea have been shaped as much by hierarchical relations and abstracted ideals of progress as by visions of freedom and autonomy. In the context of Japan's imperial legacy and America's economic influence, these visions have often positioned human subjects as objects at the mercy of technical systems of power and organization. The convergence of these legacies has produced a modern South Korean subject who is simultaneously a biopolitical being, aligned with formal regimes of knowledge, health, and productivity, an economic agent tasked with personal wealth accumulation, and a consumer orientated towards self-directed freedom, agential transformation, and autonomous choice. This convergence is perhaps most evident in South Korea's academic credentialism, known as Hakbol Sahoe, where participation in elite institutions not only facilitates access to the highest-paying jobs, but also determines one's social status, producing an achievement subject whose sense of autonomy and freedom are tightly mediated by biopolitical administration, techno-scientific systems, and market logistics. For Kyung-Sup, South Korea's biopolitical neoliberal subjectivity in the 21st century is typically reinforced by this interplay of education, social status, and the country's increasing techno-scientific imperatives. As Kyung-Sup suggests, even decades of South Korea's superb modernization and development have not fundamentally altered the basic parameters of Hakbol Sahoe. In the new century, perhaps the relative weight of the institutional modernization-linked benefits of formal education has declined, as compared to its techno-scientific, hypermodernization-linked benefits. This trend seems to be reflected or anticipated in the loud slogans of Chong-Bum, informationalization, 기술립국, technology-based rise of the nation, 지식경제, knowledge economy, 지식강국, knowledge-strong economy, 분외강국, brain-strong country, and most recently, 4차 산업혁명, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Indeed, South Korea's intense orientation toward techno-scientific modernity as an epicenter of global advancement is most visible in its world-leading electronics and semiconductor industries, information and communication technologies, biotechnological and nanotechnological sectors, robotics and automation, artificial intelligence and data sciences, as well as its digital and creative tech industries. Each of these domains has contributed to the formation of South Korea's hyper-individualized, hyper-competitive biopolitical society, its mass consumerist economic order, and its restless pursuit of techno-scientific progress. In this sense, South Korea's emphasis on knowledge, information, and brain-centered technologies has created a model of progress and modernity that has increasingly outpaced the human subject, offshoring the freedom and autonomy once imagined for liberated Korean citizens onto the domain of techno-science itself. As a result, the sensations of alienation, atomization, and nihilism intensify, since techno-science has become an end in itself, reducing the subject to the status of a passive consumer. Within this order, human meaning-making is subsumed into neoliberal modes of individualized transformation, where value and identity correlate only with market optimization, visibility, and success. This dynamic is further reinforced by the hegemonies of e-sports, idol celebrity culture, and digital influencers, all supported by a biopolitical libidinal economy and media landscape, exemplified in shows like Produce 101, Physical 100, and The Influencer, which insulates self-discipline, competition, and market-orientated self-production as the normative conditions of life for Korea's youth and working-age population. Central to this vision, however, are the normative presentations of one's face, body, health, and broader appearance. As the Korean studies scholar David Tizard declares, in this hyper-competitive society, driven by the experience of a compressed post-colonial modernity, it has taken on an even more serious role. People are frequently reminded that first impressions matter, including their face, clothes, and hair. A person's external image carries huge importance. Like age, gender, and wealth, in South Korea, beauty can determine your life, your career, and your success. For Tizard, simulation and fantasy function as the ideological cohesion that binds together South Korea's fractured neoliberal order, offering individuals the seductive promise of success, fame, and eternal beauty as compensation for the brutal contradictions of restless competition and precarity. Through the idol industry, cosmetic surgery culture, influencer economies, and digital media spectacles, carefully manufactured images of sublimity provide a fantasy of upward mobility and self-perfection, even as structural inequality renders such futures unattainable for most. These hyperreal simulations stabilize South Korea's neoliberal capitalist system by manufacturing alienation as aspiration, all whilst channeling personal desires into endless cycles of self-commodification, self-discipline, exposure, and performance. Yet, beneath this veneer, the very reliance on fantasy intensifies the drift toward nihilism, as the idol industry reveals fractures in its ideological consistency through suicides, burnout, and celebrity scandals. Whilst cosmetic surgery culture endlessly remakes the body, it reveals that perfection is always deferred, leaving behind regret, addiction, and disfigurement. And the influencer economy gives way to falsified lifestyles, mental anguish, and algorithmic servitude. Each of these moments of rupture discloses the fantasy for what it is, a simulation sustained by commodified violence and disposability. However, rather than dismantling the ideological pillars of fantasy, such revelations are themselves reabsorbed into the spectacle, as idol suicides are mythologized. Surgery failures reinforce the pursuit of better techniques, scandals amplify influencer visibility, and media controversies feed future spectacles. In this way, simulation provides South Korea's fractured neoliberal society with a tenuous ideological coherence, even as its exposure and artificiality reveals that nothing remains. For the Korean media studies scholar Gooyong Kim, the emergence of South Korea's prominent idol industry and the broader libidinal economy is directly related to the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the accompanying transformations in female labor and consumption. The societal upheavals caused by the crisis, combined with the International Monetary Fund bailout, compelled South Korea's neoliberal system to secure new, dependable frontiers for capital accumulation, frontiers increasingly situated upon the bodies and labor of its citizens. As Kim emphasizes in relation to the rise of the female idol, that the contemporary proliferation of K-pop female idols symbolically represents the political, economic, social, and cultural transformations of post-IMF Korea by a neoliberal replacement of a labor-intensive industry with a service one, in order to capitalize on the gendered nature of production and consumption. The first K-pop female idol group, SM Entertainment's SES, marked the beginning of the systematic management of female singers and their imagery in 1997. This came as an effort to shore up the Korean culture industry and market to overseas audiences, since the local economy was devastated by the 1997 Asian financial crisis and Korea's subsequent bailout by the IMF. This strategy is similar to the way in which the Korean popular music industry began in the post-Korean War era, when local musicians performed at various clubs for US soldiers as economic as well as cultural endeavors. Indeed, South Korea's neoliberal restructuring in the post-IMF period prioritized the rapid revival of economic growth, often at the expense of agricultural and labor-intensive industries, as production was increasingly offshored to maximize market flexibility and ensure the competitiveness of the chaebol's key export sectors. During this period, millions of South Koreans lost their jobs, with many forced to supplement lost wages or business income through the sale of household assets, taking on substantial loans and relying on extended financial networks. However, as this widespread economic dislocation unfolded, neoliberal governmentality simultaneously established the conditions through which young South Koreans could harness their own bodies, technical skills, and entrepreneurial capacities as new sites of capital accumulation and production. In this way, individual labor, creativity, and disciplined self-management became avenues for economic advancement, producing new forms of self-discipline, social competition, and visions of personal progress within the market. According to Kim, the gendered roles of working-class women throughout South Korea's rapid industrialization had historically provided exploitable and cheap labor in textile factories, through which many industrial chaebols amassed both fortune and notoriety. In a similar fashion, the bodily capacities of women were now mobilized to serve a comparable function, not as docile laboring bodies subjected to state capitalist industry, but as self-governing, self-disciplined agents of neoliberalized entrepreneurial freedom, expression and individuality. Drawing from Foucault's concept of biopower and Réaume's understanding of hypermodernity, capitalist power structures transitioned from direct industrial exploitation to capturing new forms of energy and value through the bodies, desires, and affective capacities of largely young South Koreans. This shift enabled the economy to navigate crises by energizing a libidinal economy, which simultaneously conjured new phantasms of ideological control, sustaining neoliberal social relations and class hierarchies through the promise of individual success, autonomy, beauty, and cultural capital. In the working process of the miracle on the Han River, the rhetoric of self-empowerment, self-responsibility, and voluntarism was effectively deployed to legitimize Park Chung-hee's developmental dictatorship. As the nation's ethos, the socio-cultural rhetoric ceaselessly and effectively mobilized rural, unwed women to work as an obedient, docile, cheap, disposable workforce on the sweatshop floors of textile factories. Now, the same ethos is spectacularly and sensationally deployed in post-IMF neoliberal Korea through the K-pop industry. Consequently, since politics is what links value and exchange in the social life of commodities, it is no coincidence that the former president, Park Geun-hye, daughter of the dictator President Park Chung-hee, declared that the second miracle on the Han River would be realized through Korea's popular culture. Furthermore, for Kim, South Korea's cultural transformation since the turn of the 21st century represents a broader techno-cultural shift, as the rise of South Korean popular culture, and K-pop in particular, has played a significant role in positioning the country as an epicenter of advanced techno-scientific production. This has allowed South Korea's globalized, export-orientated economy to maintain international attention and attract inflows of foreign capital, with the K-pop industry now incorporating non-Korean idols into its wider libidinal apparatus. As Kim observes, this transformation establishes Korean popular culture as a mere marketing strategy to promote the state and to host foreign capital as soft power. In this respect, K-pop is regarded as a culture technology economy for revitalizing Korea's post-industrial, service-orientated neoliberal economy, along with the four strategic technologies: information and communication technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and environmental technology. Crucially for Kim, K-pop and Korean pop culture more broadly operates not merely as a form of entertainment, but as a cultural technology of governance, one that fuses aesthetics, affect, and consumption into a tightly regulated system of neoliberal subject formation. The idol influencer system and its global dissemination reveal how South Korean popular culture has been mobilized as a mechanism of image-based social reproduction, producing both desire and discipline through staged perfection that transcends the structural boundaries of space and time through condensed digital circulation. Through this image-based techno-cultural redirection of conscious attention and personal desires, Korean pop culture creates a simulated and fantastical social reality through which pleasure, beauty, fame, and eternal youth emerge as the foundational ideals of the human experience, against that of the disregarded underlying realities of precarity, disposability, and systemic insecurity in neoliberal South Korean society. In this context, the 20th century French philosopher Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle becomes a powerful theoretical lens of analysis. For as Kim observes, Theoretically, the board Society of Spectacle captures how K-pop has been an integral part of Korea's increasing neoliberalization, characterized with the production and consumption of images, staged media events, and consumerism. Via K-pop's glossy, sexualized spectacles, everyday experiences are mediated and conditioned to the extent that the spectacle constitutes social relationships based on and mediated by images, and it is integral to capitalist imperatives that cultivate the cultural mechanism of consumption and entertainment. Textually, equipped with highly crafted spectacles as a manifestation of ideal beauty and propriety, K-pop is a neoliberal ideology of positive thinking, filled with color, play, camaraderie, and love, which forces the audience to focus on a positive, rosy future of society. In this respect, considering that a capitalist economy is dependent upon a seamless continuation of consumption, K-pop idols are cultural linchpins that teach and provide cues to utilizing commodities as a means of self-transformation into someone better. By doing so, they help mobilize individuals to be a steady force of neoliberal consumerism, while invoking an asocial fantasy of evading established rules and the romanticism of narcissistic pleasure as cultural amnesia. K-pop's relentless repetition of fantasy enforces a feedback loop upon its audiences that entraps them in the eternal return of always wanting more. Moreover, with the rise of artificial intelligence and virtual technologies within South Korea, young South Koreans, in an increasing competitive labor market, now find themselves competing with virtual idols and influencers who are imbued with technical skills, flawless beauty, and perfect performance, incapable of aging, incapable of error, and entirely optimized for visibility and engagement. These fully realized digital subjects exist solely to perform and circulate within neoliberal logics of consumption, productivity, attention, and market value, completing the trajectory toward a virtualized nihilism, in which human aspiration, achievement, and desire are to be measured only against an impossible, artificial ideal. As Tizard reaffirms, the already super intense beauty standards that South Korean people were struggling to contend with just got a whole lot harder, because now Koreans are no longer competing with other people. Instead, they are competing with something that can always look perfect. South Korea is now seeing the emergence of a new citizen, a virtual citizen, perfect, innocent, and compliant. While South Korea has largely recovered from the 1997 Asian financial crisis and IMF bailout in terms of macroeconomic stability and global competitiveness, the sacrifices imposed on its working class in the post-IMF neoliberal restructuring period have endured. Unemployment, labor precarity, household debt, and inequality have deepened rather than receded. Today, nearly 40% of South Korea's workforce remains in irregular employment, earning lower wages and fewer benefits, whilst the exploitation of migrant labor from the global south supplements domestic labor shortages. Household debt has soared to levels exceeding 100% of GDP, now among the highest in the world and unprecedented elsewhere in Asia, whilst inequality and poverty continue to rise, particularly among the elderly. This erosion of living standards has coincided with greater technological integration, where the combined pressures of relentless competition, social fragmentation, and technological acceleration have driven South Korea's fertility rate to the lowest in the world. In this trajectory, the working class has been abandoned from the nation's vision of progress, as South Korea's techno-scientific domains advance with little regard for the population itself. As the economists Chong-Bum An and Barry Bosworth note with regard to South Korea's widening inequality, that in the early 1990s, Korea was often showcased as a country that had combined extraordinary rates of economic growth with a narrowing of income distribution. Korea also exhibited strong gains in other dimensions of economic welfare, reducing the rate of unemployment to a remarkably low 2% of the workforce by the mid-1990s and achieving relatively low rates of poverty. However, in the years following the 1997-1998 financial crisis, the income distribution has deteriorated, returning to levels of inequality exhibited in the early 1980s. Unemployment soared for an extended period, and rates of poverty have risen to levels well above those of the pre-crisis era. Furthermore, within Korea, the public's perceptions of the progress toward reducing social and economic inequalities have been consistently less favorable than those of foreign observers, and opinion polls reflect a belief that the gap between the rich and the poor has widened over time, a belief that has intensified since the 1997-1998 crisis. Most notably, the 1997 Asian financial crisis not only initiated South Korea's unequal neoliberal restructuring, but also marked the beginning of its rising suicide rates, a crisis that has since become a defining social wound. Today, South Korea holds the highest suicide rate in the world, with around 13,000 people taking their own lives in 2022. Unlike the global downward trend, South Korea's suicide rate has nearly doubled over the past 2 decades, with suicide ranking as the nation's 6th leading cause of death in 2022, following illnesses such as cancer and heart disease. Whilst rates remain highest among the elderly since 2011, an equally concerning development has been the rise in suicides among younger generations, from which suicide has been the leading cause of death for South Koreans aged 10 to 24. As the authors of the 2029 book titled Beyond Death, The Politics of Suicide and Martyrdom in Korea declare, suicide has resurfaced as a major concern in contemporary South Korea, following the impact of the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98. The country has had the highest suicide rate in the world among Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. In South Korea, throwing oneself off a bridge over the Han River remains a common way to take one's life. Used for this purpose, it has become known as the suicide bridge. Poverty among the elderly, education-related anxiety among the youth, and economic uncertainty among the middle-aged are commonly cited as the chief factors behind suicide in South Korea. Suicide is, however, by no means a strictly modern phenomenon. Debates over meaningful suicide had persisted throughout the Joseon dynasty. In 20th century Korea, meaningful suicide and the sacrifice of one's life for a cause were intimately linked to the politics of national sovereignty, anti-colonial resistance, and post-colonial democratization. Whilst the authors recognize the current tragedy of South Korea's suicide rates in relation to the pressures of modern neoliberal capitalist life, they further argue that the phenomenon cannot be understood in isolation, but must be placed within a deeper cultural lineage in Korean history. From the Confucian ideals of self-sacrifice during the Joseon dynasty to the revolutionary sacrifices and acts of martyrdom under colonial rule, suicide in the context of Korean history has symbolically mediated the relation between the individual and society, providing a final gesture of meaning in the face of suffering and a means of inscribing one's legacy into the collective memory of society. In this sense, contemporary suicides, though stripped of the communal honor and symbolic resistance once attached to them, still bear traces of this historical inheritance, where the act itself becomes entangled with questions of meaning, suffering, dignity, and the unbearable weight of societal expectation. In the early 20th century, the upsurge in individual suicides should be seen as the outgrowth of Koreans' troubled interactions with modern capitalism and liberalism under the status constraints of colonial rule and/or modern civilization. We see the emergence of Korea's modern practices of martyrdom as an integral part of political and intellectual struggles over how best to confront the distressing problems of modernity from a nation-centered perspective. At the same time, the strategic uses of meaningful deaths in the 20th century evolved from the existing practices of the Joseon era. After liberation in 1945, in South Korea, the politics of martyrdom evolved further into a specialized set of cultural symbols and practices that gave acute expression to the social and economic suffering of life under authoritarian developmentalism, intensified by Cold War realities. In the 21st century, however, suicides typically fail to elicit much of a response from a largely indifferent South Korean public. Whilst South Korea's media landscape has undeniably contributed to sustaining the hegemonic neoliberal mode of existence that underlies many of the nation's contradictions and crises, it has also generated works that critically expose and interrogate those very conditions. Much of contemporary South Korean media, though often operating within the framework of capitalist realism, has addressed these social tensions directly, whether in Parasite's brutal depiction of class stratification, Squid Game's allegory of debt, desire, and precarity, or other mediums that foreground systemic crisis. Even earlier works from the first decade of the 21st century, such as Old Boy and The Host, gestured toward deeper anxieties about alienation, social decay, and the persistent shadow of US military influence in shaping South Korea's trajectory of modernization. In Season 1, Episode 2 of the South Korean Netflix series Squid Game, several books appear in association with one of the antagonists orchestrating the cruel and deadly games, serving as symbolic markers of South Korea's ruthless neoliberal capitalist system. These texts include Albert Camus' The Stranger, Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a René Magritte art book, and Jacques Lacan's The Theory of Desire, among others focused on philosophy and visual art. Collectively, these works reveal the psychological and societal tensions underlying modern neoliberal South Korean life. Camus and Nietzsche symbolically evoke existential despair and the quest for meaning in a nihilistic society. Magritte's surrealism reveals the dissonance between perception and reality, and Lacan's theory illuminates how desire is never fully autonomous, but structured by external forces, or what he terms as the other, reflecting the ways in which individuals are shaped to restlessly pursue desires that can never be fully realized or satisfied, ensuring perpetual strife and repetition towards sublime objects of unattainable satisfaction. As soon as the subject comes to be, he owes it to a certain non-being on which he raises his being. And if he isn't something, he obviously bears witness to some kind of absence. But he will always remain purveyor of this absence. I mean that he will bear the burden of its proof for lack of being capable of proving the presence. For the 20th century French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the human subject is defined in relation to a lack or absence rather than a fully realized presence. In this sense, the non-being he emphasizes refers to the void at the core of human existence, an absence that can never be entirely replaced or fully reconciled. Crucially, it is from this non-being that desire emerges, driving the human subject to constantly seek, yet ultimately fail, to satisfy the emptiness at the heart of its being. This condition propels the subject forward, structuring all human experience, relations, and behaviors toward an ever-elusive object of desire. Desire, therefore, can never fully encompass the subject or be holistically realized, as it is fundamentally bound to what is missing rather than to what is present. Hence, Lacan suggests that the subject is always a purveyor of absence, eternally orientated toward the pursuit of a lack that defines its very existence. In contrast to Lacan, the 20th century French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari conceive of desire as a productive and affirmative force that actively constructs reality, social relations, and connections, rather than being purely defined by lack or absence. For Deleuze and Guattari, the human subject is embedded within assemblages, networks of people, objects, systems, and machinic infrastructures, through which desire flows and generates relations and possibilities. Whilst Deleuze and Guattari share Lacan's insight that desire is never fully attainable, Deleuze and Guattari frame this unattainability not as a source of lack, but as the engine driving and sustaining the persistent formation of new modes of connection, innovation, and social production. In this framework, Deleuze and Guattari dismantle rigid dichotomies, such as nature versus society, production versus consumption, and subject versus object, conceiving all relations instead as processes of reality production, where every element participates in the continual creation and transformation of the world. Every machine functions as a break in the flow in relation to the machine to which it is connected, but at the same time is also a flow itself, or the production of a flow in relation to the machine connected to it. Fundamentally, for Deleuze and Guattari, desire operates through what they call desiring machines, which are the basic units of these assemblages. Rather than being confined to a psyche or personal subjectivity, desire is immanent and distributed across these relational networks. In this sense, desire both constitutes and is constituted by the assemblage, as it organizes flows of energy, mediates interactions, and fuels the ongoing construction and transformation of social, material, and technological realities. From this understanding, South Korea sustains its neoliberal capitalist system by channeling desire through intricate assemblages that weave together individuals, technologies, media, institutions, and infrastructures, generating a self-reinforcing cycle of production, consumption, and techno-social engagement that renders the lingering structures of neoliberal domination largely invisible or psychologically normalized. Through the dynamic interplay between human subjectivity, libidinal economic centers, simulated realities, and techno-scientific apparatuses, individuals are ensnared within a hybrid environment that incessantly measures, displays, and optimizes behavior, translating desire into quantifiable metrics of engagement, performance, and productivity. Within this predominantly artificial terrain, meaning is manufactured through mediated experiences, cultivating the semblance of fulfillment, aspiration, and social advancement, all while simultaneously reproducing entrenched class hierarchies, labor precarity, and pervasive biopolitical surveillance central to South Korea's neoliberal regime. By orchestrating desire as a continual, productive flow across these techno-cultural networks, the system preempts the onset of nihilism, as subjects remain enmeshed in cycles of striving, performing, and connecting within the simulated order, enacting an illusory sense of purpose that conceals the techno-scientific nihilism at the core of South Korean modernity, thereby ensuring both the reproduction of social stability and the perpetuation of the neoliberal apparatus. In attesting to the artificial milieu in which the neoliberal subject's very sense of desire is co-constituted and biopolitically managed, the American journalist Ellis Hu observes of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, that South Korea's capital is an endless assault of images blasting in your direction on every street corner, at every hour. Many of them are faces. They tower above you on digital signage glowing from the sides of skyscrapers, flash by in subway stations deep underground, or whip past on cars topped with oversized screens. It is a city that feels like a living monument to conspicuous consumption, with upscale malls, blinding lights, and blinding wealth, everything hitting you with its height and size and newness. Crucially, South Korea's trajectory of progress and modernization is deeply entangled in contradictions, for it is not simply the unfolding of a neutral modernity building project, but the convergence of multiple, often antagonistic, historical visions of progress. As the inheritor of the Korean independence vision, South Korea carries the emancipatory desire for national autonomy and dignity. Yet, this is simultaneously burdened by the enduring imprint of the imperial Japanese modernization project, which left behind infrastructures and institutions of biopolitical modes of control and knowledge production. Likewise, the legacy of the democracy movement insisted on democratic freedom, equality, and the rights of the people. Yet, this too has been subsumed within an American neoliberal capitalist framework that prioritizes economic growth, mass consumerism, individualism, market liberalization, and technological competition over class struggle and collective solidarity. This contradiction certainly does not entirely erase the legacy of the democracy movement, but rather sublimates parts of its emancipatory energy into the apparatus of neoliberal progress. Together, these forces of progress ultimately converge into South Korea's techno-scientific vision of modernity that at once fuels national pride, economic strength, and global competitiveness, but also exacerbates inequality, accelerates labor precarity, and deepens the sense of surveillance, alienation, and exhaustion among the population, leading to intensified expressions of nihilism. These overlapping visions fundamentally create a contradictory future where progress is simultaneously experienced as liberation and domination, promise and despair, modernization and alienation, leaving South Korea both a showcase of advanced techno-scientific modernity and a warning of its profound sacrifices. Despite the contradictions of its techno-scientific modernization, South Korea has in many ways fulfilled key aspirations of the independence movement by becoming a sovereign, democratic nation with a vibrant socio-political culture. What began as a struggle for autonomy against colonial rule has since crystallized into a society where mass protest, grassroots activism, and civil disobedience have repeatedly reshaped the political order, from the ousting of military dictatorships to the impeachment of presidents in the 21st century. The vision of a self-determined Korea, once articulated in the March 1st movement and sustained through decades of resistance, finds expression today in South Korea's capacity to uphold democratic institutions, ensure competitive elections, and maintain a robust public sphere in which citizens actively contest and influence power. In this sense, the independence movement's legacy endures not only in the preservation of sovereignty, but also in the persistence of a democracy-centered political movement that insists the Korean people remain the ultimate arbiters of their collective destiny. Moreover, the dynamics of an inverted progressive modernity and techno-scientific nihilism are not confined to South Korea alone, but are equally symptomatic of a broader global neoliberal capitalist world, finding clear expression in the West as well. What emerges is a paradoxical condition in which societies across the world that proclaim themselves at the forefront of modernity are increasingly haunted by the disorientating effects of their own innovations and ideals, revealing that the contradictions of progress are not peripheral but constitutive of techno-scientific modernity itself. Furthermore, the notion of compressed modernity is equally, if not in some cases more intensely apparent, in neighboring societies, where countries such as China have emerged as epicenters of the modern Promethean capitalist model, fusing rapid industrialization, authoritarian governance, hyper-individualism, surveillance, and mass consumer culture into a model of accelerated progress that simultaneously amplifies global capitalist logics and escalates internal contradictions between tradition, state power, and the relentless drive for consumption and growth. Chinese cities such as Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Chongqing exemplify this rapid transformation, fusing Confucian traditions, Western influence, Maoist communism, and global neoliberal capitalism into densely compressed urban forms, social rhythms, and lived experiences of 21st century Asian modernity. East Asian countries not only boast of many historic cities of traditional governance, culture, and commerce, but also have undergone explosively rapid or condensed urbanization in the course of sequential industrializations. In mega-size urban places, dense blocks of modern, if not altogether Western life are juxtaposed with museum-like pockets of traditional indigenous culture and politics. Overnight creation of huge bed towns and industrial cities is all too usual, so is overnight spread of modern and/or Western lifestyles. On the other hand, refined versions of middle-class consciousness and/or neo-traditional forms of authoritarian political rule often help to both resurrect traditional indigenous facades and incorporate cosmopolitan values and desires in private and public life. With the advent of the fourth technological revolution and the accelerating imperatives of global techno-scientific development, new centers of compressed modernity are already beginning to emerge across diverse regions, ensuring that South Korea is no longer a singular exemplar, but one among many societies navigating the paradoxes of accelerated modernization, technological dependence, and neoliberal rationality. As artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital infrastructures expand the horizon of what is possible, the forms of social life, governance, and economic organization that arise will increasingly resemble the compressed, hybridized modernities that South Korea has embodied for decades. Yet, the future of South Korea itself remains uncertain. Its path will be shaped by the tensions between innovation and inequality, freedom and control, desire and nihilism. The possibility for change is, however, by no means foreclosed, for within these contradictions lie spaces to reimagine what it means to progress, to reconsider the human relation to technology, to reassert the human outside the rationality of techno-science, and to forge a modernity not dictated solely by the logics of capital, but orientated toward more vitalistic and affirmative futures.